The moments when you feel most efficient and socially flawless are precisely when you are completely absent from your own life. You nod through conversations while your inner gaze stares blankly, completing a perfect day without a single genuine impulse. This automatic existence was recognized by Jung as the quiet extinction of the inner world. What you call your identity is merely a functional shield, hiding the reality that your center went silent long ago. We frequently encounter individuals who appear remarkably well-adjusted, carrying out their professions with immaculate precision and maintaining unblemished reputations. They speak with calculated warmth, perform duties without error, and seamlessly adapt to every shifting expectation of their environment. Yet, looking closer, a strange, unsettling quality emerges from their presence, a hollow equilibrium suggesting something fundamental has been quietly hollowed out. In analytical psychology, this state is defined not as a triumph of character, but as a profound psychic catastrophe known as total persona fusion. The persona is inherently meant to be a flexible social mask, a dynamic mediator between the vulnerable inner life and the demanding external world. When this mask hardens into a permanent visage, the individual ceases to wear the disguise and instead becomes it. This absorption initiates a catastrophic structural detachment within the psyche, creating a severed ego-self axis. The conscious ego, which should remain in constant communication with the deeper core of the objective psyche, completely isolates itself from the source of its vital force. Consider the subtle physical exhaustion that settles heavily in your chest after a long day of performing the expected version of yourself for others. This pervasive fatigue is not a consequence of physical labor, but the silent structural friction of an ego that has starved its own unconscious roots to feed an artificial image. You sit alone in your car in the driveway, staring at the dashboard for 20 minutes, unable to muster the energy to open the door and step into your own home. This paralyzing inertia reflects the precise moment where the persona has drained the remaining reserves of your psychic energy, leaving the conscious mind stranded without underlying emotional sustenance. When the connection to the deep unconscious is broken, the internal architecture collapses, leaving a biological shell moving through the world purely on momentum. This is the state that Jungian thinkers identified as true soul loss, a condition where a person continues to function biologically while their interiority has effectively vanished. The individual becomes a beautifully crafted vessel containing absolutely nothing inside, operating entirely on external stimuli. This condition creates a peculiar paradox, where the most praised individuals are often the ones most deeply disconnected from their humanity. We celebrate the untiring professional, never realizing that their stability may actually be the rigor mortis of an extinguished psyche. They do not suffer from visible neuroses or struggle with the shadow, because the internal arena where these conflicts should take place has been entirely abandoned. But this absolute internal silence introduces a terrifying question regarding human consciousness. If the vital connection between the conscious ego and the deeper self can be completely severed without causing biological collapse, then what is actually driving the body forward through its daily routines? We are forced to confront the chilling possibility that a person can lose their inner world entirely while remaining completely indistinguishable from those who still possess one. This leaves us hovering over a darker, unresolved mystery concerning the hidden forces that occupy the vacuum when a human being goes silent. This absolute internal silence does not announce itself with dramatic psychological crises. It masquerades as total stability. When the conscious mind fully merges with the social mask, the normal friction of inner life vanishes, creating a deceptive state of peace that looks like maturity but functions as a psychological graveyard. The person who feels absolutely no internal conflict, who experiences no sudden surges of unexplained anxiety or unfulfilled longing, is often celebrated as having achieved perfect balance. Yet, this seamless alignment with the world is the primary symptom of an advanced psychic erasure. The paradox lies in the fact that genuine mental health requires a continuous, often uncomfortable dialogue with the unconscious. When that dialogue stops, the tension disappears, but it disappears only because one of the speakers has been effectively silenced. We are left looking at an individual who is structurally flawless, yet entirely devoid of the creative chaos that makes a human being truly alive. The deeper uncertainty deepens when we observe how this hollow equilibrium affects everyday perception. The individual still responds to beauty, still expresses affection, and still participates in social rituals, but these actions are executed as learned habits rather than felt experiences. They do not choose their reactions. The social mask chooses for them, pulling the appropriate emotional response from a reservoir of past observations. This raises the unsettling question: if the inner world is empty, who is actually experiencing the life being lived? The person becomes a ghost inhabiting their own biography, watching themselves perform actions without ever feeling the weight of existence. They are trapped in a state of absolute predictability, where every choice is predetermined by the expectations of their environment, leaving no room for the spontaneous eruption of the unconscious. The mask does not simply hide the inner world, it replaces it entirely, absorbing the ego until the boundary between the performance and the performer dissolves completely. This brings us to a critical threshold where the psychological machinery takes over the seat of consciousness. If the human identity can be completely overwritten by external expectations, then the very concept of an individual sovereign mind begins to collapse. We must look past the smooth veneer of this social perfection to see the invisible mechanism that quietly directs the movements of the hollowed psyche, wondering what happens when the mechanical momentum finally faces an experience it cannot replicate. To understand how this inner emptiness sustains itself without causing a visible breakdown, we must look at how the objective psyche handles the total suppression of its natural impulses. The unconscious does not simply cease to exist when it is cut off from the conscious ego. Rather, its energy is forced inward, transforming from a source of creative renewal into an invisible, stagnant weight. In Jungian psychology, the psychic energy that normally flows between the inner world and outer reality is known as libido. When the ego seals itself within the persona, this energy is denied its natural expression through symbols, dreams, and spontaneous emotional responses. Instead of guiding the individual toward individuation, the trapped energy begins to ossify the internal structures of the mind, quietly locking the person into rigid, repetitive behavioral patterns that operate completely outside of awareness. This process does not feel like a hostile takeover. It unfolds as a gradual, unnoticed narrowing of perception. The individual begins to filter all incoming reality through a highly selective cognitive framework that only permits information consistent with their social role. Anything that threatens to disrupt the immaculate image, a sudden surge of irrational grief, an unconventional desire, or a deeply buried doubt, is instantly intercepted and dissolved before it can reach conscious awareness. The unconscious mind, operating beneath the surface, actively manages this censorship, redirecting the threatening material into the deep shadow. Because this defense mechanism functions automatically, the person genuinely believes they are at peace, remaining completely oblivious to the fact that their field of awareness is shrinking every day. As the unconscious becomes increasingly isolated, it loses its ability to compensate for the biases of the conscious mind. In a healthy psyche, dreams and intuitive impulses act as essential correctives, forcing the ego to confront what it has ignored or repressed during waking life. But when the ego self-axis is severed, these corrective messages can no longer break through the dense armor of the persona. The individual becomes completely immune to their own deeper wisdom, navigating life solely through the cold logic of social compliance and external validation. They move through their days with absolute certainty, unaware that this certainty is actually the final stage of an invisible confinement, where the walls are built from the very rewards and praise offered by the collective world. To comprehend how this psychological condition interacts with the world, we must examine the specific mechanics of human perception and how it constructs what we choose to call reality. The mind does not merely absorb external data like a passive mirror. Instead, it actively projects its internal architecture outward, organizing the chaotic flux of existence into a coherent, recognizable landscape. When an individual achieves total identification with the persona, this projection mechanism undergoes a fundamental distortion. The conscious mind ceases to project personal meaning and instead begins to project the rigid, standardized expectations of the collective culture. Consequently, the reality they inhabit is no longer an authentic canvas of personal experience, but a curated reflection of social consensus, a world where objects and people are perceived only through the narrow lens of their utilitarian functions. This distortion provides a chilling resolution to our earlier question regarding what actually animates the physical body when the individual interiority has gone silent. We often fear that the empty vessel is driven by a vacuum, yet the psychological reality is far more unsettling. The individual is not empty. Rather, the abdication of the unique conscious ego allows the autonomous weight of the collective unconscious to flood the vacuum. When you separate yourself from the deeper self, you do not become nothing, you become everyone. The social mask becomes a conduit for the mass mind, meaning that the person is no longer an independent agent, but a localized fragment of collective behavior, speaking words and performing actions dictated entirely by the broader cultural currents. The tragedy of this state is that the individual perceives this complete loss of unique sovereignty as the ultimate form of emotional stability and social correctness. They move through a highly organized, perfectly predictable world, entirely unaware that their perception has been completely flattened to match the lowest common denominator of mass social compliance. Their reality is perfectly stable because it contains no personal depth, no unpredictable emotional terrain, and absolutely no authentic confrontation with the untamed forces of the objective psyche. Yet this absolute predictability contains its own hidden, slow destruction, an unnoticed erosion of the inner architecture that continues entirely unabated until the mechanical momentum of the body inevitably collides with an existential truth that no social mask can absorb or replicate. Your immaculate life is a beautifully orchestrated illusion, maintained only until the absolute silence within begins to scream. This internal screaming does not emerge as a sudden vocalization, but as a series of rigid behavioral loops that manifest in the subtle architecture of daily routine. The somatic shell begins to execute movements with an unnatural, stylized perfection that serves to repress the growing vacuum beneath. When sitting in business meetings, the posture remains flawlessly upright, while the eyes remain entirely devoid of genuine curiosity. In conversations with close associates, the laughter is emitted at precisely measured intervals to simulate authentic engagement. The hands gesture with practiced elegance to mask the profound paralysis affecting the deeper choice-making faculties. Every social transaction is treated as a tactical negotiation rather than an opportunity for mutual vulnerability. This meticulous regulation of behavior represents the final stage of total identification, where the unconscious mind uses the physical body to act out a simulation of a life that has already departed. This rigid behavioral patterning operates as an efficient information filter, protecting the conscious ego from the terrifying realization that it has surrendered its autonomy to the collective mass. In the domain of pure perception, the mind becomes incapable of processing any environmental cue that contradicts its narrative of fulfillment. When a spontaneous memory of childhood wonder unexpectedly pierces the consciousness, the psychic mechanism immediately misinterprets this visitation as a fleeting symptom of physical fatigue. The individual does not perceive this censorship as a limitation, but rather as a profound sense of security. This introduces a subtle paradox where the person feels most safe precisely when their psychological imprisonment is most complete. They have transformed their physical existence into a predictable, non-verbal projection of social duty, ensuring that the disruptive whisper of the unconscious is drowned out by constant external validation. This absolute reliance on outer validation reveals a structural dependency that converts the human psyche into a passive instrument of external forces. When the internal guide is severed, the individual must constantly scan the environment to verify the validity of their own existence. This constant scanning manifests as a perpetual, subtle hypervigilance disguised as exceptional social grace. You find yourself smiling before you have even comprehended the humor, agreeing to obligations before assessing your inner capacity and adjusting your posture to match the comfort of those around you. The tragedy of this refined adaptation is that the mirror of the world eventually stops reflecting a real person, leaving only a responsive shadow dancing in an empty room. This profound alienation is closer to your immediate experience than you dare to admit, hiding just beneath the surface of your most organized habits. When the conscious ego completely abdicates its role to the social mask, the individual ceases to possess a private ethical boundary. In this state of total internal erasure, the capacity for genuine moral reflection is entirely replaced by an absolute alignment with external mandates. This structural transformation reveals the precise nature of the danger posed by those who feel nothing is missing from their psychic existence. Because they experience no internal friction, no agonizing doubts, and no structural conflict between the conscious mind and the repressed shadow, they are capable of executing the most destructive collective directives with complete emotional tranquility. The traditional concept of malice requires an active, conscious choice to inflict harm. The hollowed psyche, however, inflicts harm through mere compliance, acting as a flawless conductor for the volatile impulses of the collective mass. This absolute submission to external authority creates an eerie form of psychological immunity that shields the individual from the natural consequences of their choices. When a person with an intact interiority commits an act that violates their deeper ethical alignment, the objective psyche responds immediately with acute anxiety, neurosis, or terrifying compensatory dreams. These painful symptoms serve as an essential internal alarm system, forcing the conscious mind to confront its alienation from the self. But for the individual whose inner world has been erased, this alarm system has been permanently dismantled. They do not suffer from the weight of guilt because there is no longer an independent, sovereign mind to register the betrayal of the human soul. They sleep soundly, move efficiently, and maintain an impeccable public reputation, while simultaneously serving as the unthinking instruments of institutionalized violence or cultural decay. The illusion of their innocence is maintained precisely because they look, speak, and act like the most exemplary products of their environment. They are often found at the apex of institutional structures, managing complex social systems with a cold, unshakable competence that commands widespread respect. This structural reality introduces an unsettling truth regarding the mechanics of collective human catastrophe. The most profound historical horrors are rarely driven by explicitly malicious individuals, but are instead sustained by an army of perfectly adapted, structurally hollowed entities who perceive their own total lack of internal conflict as the ultimate proof of maturity, sanity, and social progress. To fully grasp the framework of this containment, we must examine what can be termed the noumenal trap of the hollowed consciousness. In classical philosophy, a fundamental distinction is made between the phenomenon, the world as it appears to our immediate senses, and the noumenon, the underlying essential reality that remains forever hidden behind those appearances. In a healthy psychic structure, the rigorous process of individuation requires the conscious ego to constantly pierce through the phenomenal illusions of the social world in order to establish a direct, living relationship with the noumenal depth of the objective psyche. However, when interiority is completely erased, the individual becomes permanently confined within the surface layer of social appearances. They mistake the collective consensus for ultimate reality, remaining completely oblivious to the vast, unseen psychological forces that operate beneath the superficial fabric of their daily awareness. This structural confinement completely alters the individual's relationship with fate and personal destiny. True psychological development demands a profound, often agonizing confrontation with one's own limitations, a willing integration of the dark shadow, and a conscious acceptance of life's inherent suffering, a state of courageous alignment that represents the true integration of fate. But within the boundaries of the noumenal trap, this deep existential alignment is perverted into a superficial parody of acceptance. The individual misinterprets their passive surrender to social expectations as a form of enlightened peace. When they encounter personal tragedy or systemic collapse, they do not experience authentic grief or a transformative crisis of meaning. Instead, they absorb the shock through the protective buffering of the persona, coolly rationalizing the disruption through pre-packaged cultural narratives that strip the experience of all raw human significance. This profound perversion of psychological growth creates a closed loop that effectively neutralizes the possibility of any future awakening. Because the individual feels entirely content within their structural limitations, they actively resist any internal or external impulse that threatens to shatter their immaculate equilibrium. They have achieved a state of absolute psychological stasis that masquerades as supreme fulfillment, demonstrating that the ultimate tragedy of human existence is not the failure to achieve social validation, but the terrifying ease with which the sovereign mind can mistake total internal imprisonment for ultimate liberation. You watch them move through the world with absolute certainty, unaware that their peaceful existence is merely the quiet rigor of a tomb, where the door has been locked from the inside by the very hand that sought to protect it. The final resolution of this psychological trajectory does not culminate in a dramatic collapse or a sudden redemptive awakening. Instead, it solidifies into a permanent, unchallenged state of existence that represents the ultimate triumph of the social mask over the sovereign mind. Once the erasure of interiority is absolute, the objective psyche is completely sealed away, leaving a perfectly functioning human organism that navigates the social world with flawless precision and zero internal resistance. This is the definitive state of psychological stasis, where the individual has successfully traded the painful, volatile work of individuation for the absolute safety of collective mass compliance. The terrifying reality of this condition is that it is entirely invisible from the outside. It looks exactly like success, maturity, and ultimate psychological stability. We are forced to confront the chilling realization that this structural hollowing is not an isolated malfunction of the mind, but the very destination toward which modern collective structures actively push the individual. The social architecture rewards the elimination of inner friction, systematically praising the persona while penalizing the spontaneous, disruptive movements of the true self. Consequently, the person who feels absolutely nothing is missing is not a biological anomaly, but the perfected expression of a hyper-adapted human being. They walk among us as pillars of the community, filling institutional roles with cold efficiency, totally unaware that they have committed the ultimate form of self-betrayal. They have allowed their unique consciousness to be entirely dissolved into the collective unconscious, transforming their existence into a passive, responsive echo of external mandates. Ultimately, this investigation brings us face to face with a profound diagnostic warning regarding our own psychological alignment. The boundary between an authentically lived life and a state of complete psychic erasure is remarkably fluid, maintained only by our willingness to endure the continuous, uncomfortable tension of our own inner contradictions. The moment we seek to permanently eliminate that discomfort by surrendering our autonomy to external consensus, we step onto the path of our own psychological dissolution. The tragedy of the empty vessel is not that it suffers, but precisely that it can no longer suffer the necessary pain of growth. In the end, the most dangerous people are not those who harbor a volatile, conflicted inner world, but those who have successfully transformed their inner world into a silent, immaculate void, mistaking the quietude of a psychological grave for the peace of ultimate liberation.